You owe US $95,000, my stepfather shouted, right after spoiling Claire with an $8,500 cruise and sending me a bill for existing as a burden. I told him, I'm your stepchild, not your employee. Then one decision destroyed their secret empire. I, 33 am, never thought a family dinner would be the moment my entire world shifted, but there I was, staring at an itemized bill that detailed every penny my stepfather claimed I owed them for raising me. The paper trembled in my hands as I read line after line. Groceries, utilities, clothing, school supplies, even birthday presents from when I was 12. Everything had a price tag. Everything had been calculated and stored away like some twisted accounting ledger. At the bottom, in bold red ink, was the total, $95,000. My stepfather stood across from me in their pristine kitchen, his face flushed with righteous anger, explaining how I needed to start paying them back now that I had a decent job. He'd been building up to this moment for weeks, dropping hints about responsibility and gratitude, but I never imagined it would come to this. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just 3 days earlier, I'd watched them send my stepsister Claire off on an $8,500 Mediterranean cruise for her college graduation. She'd posted photos from the airport, grinning beside her designer luggage, while I'd been working double shifts to afford my own rent. I told him I was his stepchild, not his employee, and that normal parents don't charge their kids for basic necessities. The conversation escalated quickly. My mother sat silently at the kitchen table, avoiding eye contact, which told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalties lay. That night, I drove home to my small apartment with my hands still shaking from anger. But as the initial shock wore off, something else took its place: curiosity. How exactly had they afforded Claire's lavish lifestyle, while apparently keeping such detailed records of my expenses? My stepfather worked as a mid-level manager at a manufacturing company, and my mother was a part-time receptionist. The math didn't add up. I started digging. Update 1. It took me 2 weeks of careful investigation, but I found the first thread. My stepfather had been claiming me as a dependent on his taxes for years, even after I'd moved out and started filing my own returns. That was just the beginning. I discovered he'd been collecting survivor benefits meant for me from my biological father's Social Security. My dad had died when I was 8, and those monthly payments were supposed to help with my care until I turned 18. Instead, they'd been going directly into an account I never knew existed. But the real bombshell came when I found records of a college fund my paternal grandmother had set up before she passed away. $25,000 that should have been mine when I turned 18. Money that would have changed everything for me. Money that could have paid for my education instead of leaving me with crushing student loans. I confronted my mother first, thinking she might be more reasonable than my stepfather. She broke down immediately, admitting they'd used the money to pay off their mortgage and fund Claire's private school education. She claimed they'd planned to tell me eventually, that they'd intended to pay it back, but the excuses felt hollow. My stepfather was less apologetic when I confronted him. He actually had the audacity to suggest that housing and feeding me for 10 years was worth more than some measly college fund. He reminded me of the bill he'd presented, as if that somehow justified stealing my inheritance. That's when I made my decision. If they wanted to play financial hardball, I'd show them what real consequences looked like. Update 2. I started with the IRS. Reporting the fraudulent tax claims was straightforward enough, but I wanted to be thorough. I gathered every document I could find: bank statements, tax returns, benefit records, anything that showed the pattern of financial manipulation. The Social Security fraud was more serious than I'd initially realized. They'd been collecting those survivor benefits for 3 years after I'd aged out of eligibility, claiming I was still a full-time student when I wasn't. That alone carried potential criminal charges. While I waited for the government agencies to investigate, I did some digging into their current finances. What I found was a house of cards built on deception and entitlement. They'd refinanced their house twice in the past 5 years, pulling out equity to fund Claire's lifestyle. The Mediterranean cruise was just the latest in a series of expensive gifts: a car for her 16th birthday, spring break trips to Cancun, a semester abroad in Paris. All funded by money that should have been mine, supplemented by credit they couldn't actually afford. I also discovered they'd been telling extended family that I was ungrateful and demanding money from them. My aunt reached out to me after hearing their version of events, concerned that I was trying to extort my parents. When I showed her the evidence of what they'd actually done, her shock was genuine. The family started taking sides. Some believed my stepfather's narrative about ungrateful children and family obligations. Others were horrified by the systematic theft and manipulation. Holiday gatherings became tense affairs where conversations stopped when I entered the room. But I pressed forward. I'd spent too many years accepting their treatment, believing their narrative that I should be grateful for the bare minimum of care. The truth was liberating. even if it was destroying relationships. Update 3. The IRS audit hit them first. 3 months after I filed my complaint, they received notice that their tax returns for the past 7 years were under review. The penalties for fraudulent dependency claims were substantial, but the real damage came from the scrutiny it brought to their other financial activities. The Social Security investigation moved more slowly, but when it finally concluded, the results were devastating. They owed back payments totaling nearly $30,000, plus penalties and interest. My stepfather's wages were garnished, and they faced potential criminal charges for fraud. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from an attorney representing my grandmother's estate. Apparently, there had been additional provisions in her will that my stepfather had never disclosed. The college fund was just part of a larger inheritance that included stocks and bonds worth another $40,000. The attorney explained that my stepfather had been acting as trustee, but had violated his fiduciary duty by using the funds for purposes other than my benefit. The legal term was breach of trust, and it carried both civil and criminal implications. I could have pursued criminal charges, but I chose a different path. I wanted my money back, with interest, and I wanted them to face the consequences of their choices without destroying my mother completely. The settlement negotiations were brutal. Their attorney tried to argue that they'd provided value equivalent to what they'd taken, but the numbers didn't support their claims. Even accounting for reasonable expenses of raising a child, they'd stolen more than $60,000 from me over the years. They were forced to sell their house to pay the settlement. The irony was perfect. The home they'd paid off with my inheritance money was now gone, and they were left with a fraction of its value after paying legal fees and penalties. Claire's reaction was the most telling. When she learned that her privileged lifestyle had been funded by stolen money, she initially tried to defend her parents. But as the full scope of their deception became clear, even she couldn't justify it. She offered to pay back some of the money from her own savings, but I declined. She'd been a child when most of this happened. She wasn't responsible for her parents' choices. My mother's guilt was overwhelming. She'd enabled the theft for years, choosing her husband over her son, and the weight of that decision was crushing her. She tried to rebuild our relationship, but trust, once broken so completely, doesn't heal easily. My stepfather remained defiant to the end. Even as he signed the settlement papers, he maintained that he'd done nothing wrong, that raising me had been a financial burden he shouldn't have had to bear. His inability to accept responsibility was almost impressive in its consistency. The money I recovered changed my life in ways I hadn't expected. I was able to pay off my student loans, buy a decent car, and even put a down payment on a small house. But more importantly, I'd reclaimed my sense of self-worth. For years, I'd internalized their message that I was a burden, that I should be grateful for scraps of affection and basic care. Learning the truth about the money they'd stolen was painful, but it also validated every instinct I'd had about their treatment of me. The family dynamics never fully recovered. Some relatives maintained that I'd gone too far, that families should forgive and forget. Others supported my decision to hold them accountable. The division was permanent, but I found peace in knowing I'd stood up for myself. I still see my mother occasionally, though our relationship remains strained. She's living in a small apartment now, working full-time for the first time in years to make ends meet. Part of me feels guilty about her situation, but I remind myself that she made her choices just as I made mine. My stepfather and I haven't spoken since the settlement was finalized. I heard through family that he's bitter about the outcome, still convinced he was the victim in all of this. Some people never learn. The most unexpected outcome was the relationship I developed with my paternal grandmother's attorney. He'd been searching for me for years, trying to fulfill the complete terms of her will. There were other provisions I'd never known about, a trust fund that would provide additional income, and even a small property she'd owned that was supposed to transfer to me when I turned 30. My grandmother had tried to ensure I'd be taken care of, even after she was gone. The fact that my stepfather had hidden these provisions from me was perhaps the most unforgivable part of his deception. As I write this, 2 years have passed since that dinner when I was handed the bill for my existence. I'm in a better place financially and emotionally than I ever thought possible. The house I bought is small but mine, and I've started dating someone who understands my complicated family history without judgment. Sometimes people ask if I regret pursuing the matter so aggressively, if I think I should have tried to work things out privately. The answer is always no. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and some people only understand consequences when they're forced to face them. My stepfather taught me an important lesson, though probably not the one he intended. He showed me that family isn't defined by blood or marriage, but by love, respect, and genuine care. By those standards, he was never really my family at all. The $95,000 he claimed I owed him turned out to be less than half of what he actually owed me. But the real debt was never financial. It was the years of emotional manipulation, the systematic undermining of my self-worth, and the theft of opportunities that should have been mine. I collected on that debt in full, with interest. And unlike him, I can sleep peacefully knowing I earned every penny of it honestly.